Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Melissa and we are going to be covering week 1 of our personal curriculum. If you are following along with the series, we are going to be doing our winter personal curriculum. This is going to be a review of everything that I studied and learned all through the last week. My goal for this week is to review what I studied, go over our discussion prompts, review how everything went, and then also kind of discuss what we're going to be learning next week and give an honest update on where I'm at with the first week of curriculum. Let's dive right on in. For week 1, I had set some lofty goals in terms of what I planned to read, especially when it was Christmas week. Forgot about that when I was originally planning my curriculum. This week was definitely about finding that balance of adding study back into my day-to-day because it's just been so long. It was definitely something I had to adjust to. So if you're following along and you found that it was also hard for you to add that in, totally understandable. It's like taking me a minute to kind of get back into the groove. And also realistically realizing how much I can read, annotate, and also still have my creative juices flowing, especially in terms of the creative writing piece, without burning out. But we are still here. We are going to continue to work on beating the brain rot. I definitely noticed myself scrolling less, which was amazing because when I would go to pick up my phone, I was like, oh, I could be reading my book or I could be, writing in my journal. So that was definitely a positive that I've noticed so far. And I'll definitely give a full list of that later in this video. But we're going to jump right in and we're going to start with Gothic literature. For Gothic literature, I have 2 modules, which is Gothic literature and modern media and the 19th century women authors. I actually read the same novels for both, which was The Mysteries of Udolpho and then The Castle of Otranto. Those are considered like foundational text for the Gothic literature genre. The Castle of Otranto, which was written by Horace Walpole, I believe I'm saying his name correctly, that was published in 1764, and that is actually considered the very first Gothic literature text. Then you've got The Mysteries of Udolpho, which was published 30 years later by Anne Radcliffe. I really wanted to set that foundation for myself as I move into Gothic literature. I have not read these novels before, and I will say they are vastly different. If you followed along and read those, I would love for you to drop a comment and let me know what you thought, or if you've read them before, because I was not prepared, I think, fully for like how those novels read, but we're gonna dive into that. But let's first talk a little bit about the authors themselves. Anne Radcliffe is actually considered like the mother of Gothic literature. So even though her novel was written second and it was 30 years after Horace Walpole, Mysteries of Udolpho is definitely the thicker of the two. It's about 700 pages, where Castle of Otranto is like about 200. Anne Radcliffe was also the first female Gothic literature author. She actually inspired Jane Austen, Mary Shelley. They actually pulled inspiration from her and her work. And we all know that Mary Shelley went on to be the mother of science fiction. So it's very interesting to see the correlation between the two. And that definitely parlays into the women authors of the 19th century and just using that for an overall reference point for my studies. I will say I did not spend too much time researching both authors, but got a general understanding of them. I'm intrigued. I may add them into my future learning, maybe into like my spring or summer curriculum, just because Anne Radcliffe, she was really interesting to me and her writing style was very interesting. It took a little bit of time to get into. But I'm curious, especially knowing how many other authors she inspired that I genuinely enjoy reading. All right, but let's compare the two. I will say the first thing, the immediate thing that I noticed was how both authors and both novels handled the subject of fear. Right? So a lot of times with Gothic literature, people consider that as like a horror genre. And that's not necessarily true. Now, there will be horror elements maybe, but the way that they're handled in Gothic literature can be vastly different. The Castle of Otranto is definitely not subtle. It's chaotic, and the supernatural elements are in your face. I mean, we've got giant helmets, you've got like these ghost apparitions. It's all there. Whereas in the Mysteries of Udolpho, these horror or Gothic elements, it's the eerie landscape, it's the unheard noises, it's the black veil. It's a lot more subtle and psychological in nature. She's building, or Anne Radcliffe is building, the atmosphere through isolation, and it's through what she is seeing and experiencing. And I just think that really parlays into the feminine writing versus the male writing, and we're going to dive into that in a little bit. But just keep that in mind. So there's 2 styles of writing here. If you're considering Horace the father of Gothic literature and Radcliffe the mother of Gothic literature, they definitely have a different approach. And I definitely think that comes from just the feminine experience and what Anne Radcliffe as a woman probably went through versus what Horace went through. And it definitely influenced their writing style and what our main characters go through. We're going to do a quick synopsis. And I say quick, I will do my best. But I think it's really important to understand some of the comparative analysis between the two. But to do that, we have to understand the novel. And if you've never read them, here's just a little bit about what they are. I will say they're both interesting reads, and I think you should read them if you are interested in Gothic literature, or if you've read Gothic literature, to try and see where it came from, in the beginning. So I'll leave it there. Mysteries of Udolpho, like I said, is 700 pages. So naturally, we have a lot to talk about. Castle of Otranto is less than 200. It's going to be a lot quicker for us to get through. The Mysteries of Udolpho is broken up into 4 volumes. So each volume is like a different arc that our main character goes through. Your main character is Emily St. Aubert, I think is how you say her name. It's Aubert. And when we first meet Emily, you're also introduced to her father, St. Aubert. And they have the quintessential life. Her mother is loving, her father is loving. She's just got this like perfect, right, seemingly perfect and happy life. And obviously, the author spends a lot of time in description, like really explaining where they live, which is La Villa, and just like spending that time, I think, for you to understand as the reader how happy her life is, because obviously there's going to be a big shift in that later in the novel. And you're like, wow, everything just seems perfect. Well, of course, tragedy must strike. It is a novel and things must happen. Her mother gets ill and dies, and her father seems deeply upset by this. But then Emily observes him like looking at this like portrait of a woman who is not her mother, and he seems to be fondly looking at it. Then he decides that they're going to go on this like trip because he's starting to fall ill, and they're going to like head to the coast and head towards Italy. Along this adventure, they run into our second main character, Valancourt, who is this charismatic young man, reminds the father of himself at that age. He's kind of like in nature. He's a wanderer. He doesn't really stay in one place. And for a while, they travel together, and he starts to develop feelings for Emily. At some point, they like deviate past. Like he's like, I'm going to go this way. Emily and her father go the other way. Emily's father continues to fall like more ill as they're going along, and then he eventually passes on the road. So at this point, he kind of is telling Emily, I need you when you get home to burn these documents. Don't read them. Let me actually read you the exact quote that he said. So he says, these papers you must burn, and solemnly I command you without examining them. So he kind of gives her this mission and then lets her know that his sister, Madame Chiron, is going to become her custodian and guardian. They don't say her exact age for this like guardianship, but she makes it later in the novel that it's only a year until she's considered an adult. So we're going to say 18 and that she's 17. That could be totally wrong, but that's like how I envisioned it just from what they were saying. Her aunt is going to come, Madame Chiron, to La Villa and take over her care. But Madame Chiron does not seem to care for how her brother raised his daughter, does not like how Emily behaved. Valancourt comes back, tries to win her hand. She does not like Valancourt. Long story short, eventually she agrees to allow Valancourt and Emily to be married. She gets over it, but then she meets this mysterious Italian nobleman, Montino, marries him secretly, and then goes, Montino's in charge of you now. I no longer am in charge of your care. He's going to let you know if you can be married. And Montino goes, nope, you can no longer marry Valancourt. So it's like a huge shift. And as we're coming to the end of volume 1, Montino's like, I'm going to move this whole family to my castle, Udolpho, and you can no longer talk to him, be involved with him. I don't approve of this match. And so they move on. When we move into volume 2 is when we start to really see some of those traditional Gothic themes, which makes sense, is where they came from. So the first one we see is that Gothic suspense. So Radcliffe starts to use terror, right, in a psychological way. I think this is very intentional. In volume 1, we start happy. Technically, she was going to get everything she wanted by being able to marry the man she loved. And then quickly she moves to, despair by having to be sent to his castle. But she still at that time doesn't believe it's going to be horrible. She feels like it's a year of endurance. And then she gets to come back and marry who she wants, obviously. Not what happens. But when we move, like I said, when we move into volume 2, that suspense really starts to happen. She is being tortured in a psychological way. Like she's clearly kept there. She cannot leave. She has no friends. She has no contact with the outside world. And she is starting to see these really eerie things. Like the landscape itself is very eerie. She's hearing things that she doesn't know what they are. There's this very vague black veil that she doesn't know what it is. And so there's all this like constant suspense. It's kind of like when you're holding your breath, like waiting for the other shoe to drop. That's what she's going through the entire time. You also have what they call nature sublime, right? So then you start to see this beautiful landscape that she's in, but it's also a little creepy and off-putting. Like you can't exactly put your finger on why it's unsettling, but it's there. And she makes it very apparent in the way that she writes it. Then the castle itself feels very harsh. It's cold, it's creepy, it makes noises. So the landscape itself is also contributing to that feeling of dread that Emily is going through. Then there's also the element of female virtue. Emily is forced to endure. The way she is surviving is through her rationale mindset. She has to kind of like navigate these threads, and she has to have a ton of resilience and a lot of patience, because Montino at this point, he wants to marry her. He wants to get rid of his current wife, her aunt, because he wants her fortune. And he makes a lot of overtures to her, and she knows what's going on. So there's that element of arranged marriage as well. But her aunt is still alive, so it's kind of like this very unsettling balance between the two. So now Madame Chiron is known as Madame Montino. Valancourt, however, is in Paris, and he is so into his feelings. Like, he is just doesn't know who he is anymore. He doesn't know who he is without Emily. Is he a good person? He's going through his own like psychological moment where he's like really questioning a lot. He's doing things that are a little kind of like, he probably wouldn't want Emily to know about. And he just is trying to figure it out. So while she is being tortured mentally, he is torturing himself. And it's such a juxtaposition between the two, because he's doing it to himself. Like, he very well could be a better person, do what he wants. He's a man. He has all of the free will and choice to do so. Emily has no choice, but she's being resilient. She's being as strong of mind as she can. When we get back into volume 3 to pick up, Madame Montino, right? Madame Chiron, her aunt, has died of a mysterious illness, right? Mysterious illness. And the overtures, he's really trying to get Emily to marry him. So she decides it's time to escape. So she tries to escape. She is captured, brought back. We also finally figure out what this black veil is. It's this literal rotting wax corpse. Like this lovely, dead, rotting body. That is what it is. It's so weird and creepy. The volume just continues with her struggling in her captivity, trying to figure out how she can escape. Her aunt is dead. She has no one. There's some side characters that start to get introduced, other people in the castle, and she starts to form connections and friendships. And it turns out a lot of them also want to escape. In volume 4, she has a successful escape attempt. She takes some of these side characters with her. She runs back into Valancourt. He confesses everything about Paris. She literally turns away from him, is like, yeah, no, I don't want to deal with this. Then Montino gets arrested. Then she goes back to Valancourt, agrees to marry him. The side characters, like, she gets her fortune. She helps take care of them. And then we kind of get our happy ending. But a chunk of this novel is just all of what she's going through in captivity. And it's a really good read. It is a dense read, and it does take a while to get into. I will be extremely honest about that. It was hard for me probably the first 100, 200 pages, like probably through volume 1. Because they describe a lot of things in great detail that I'm like, I get it. I know where you are. Like Tolkien when he describes like a blade of grass for 20 pages. Not really, but you know what I mean. Now, a quick synopsis on the Castle of Otranto. So at the Castle of Otranto, it's less than 200 pages, like I mentioned before. You have this character called Manfred. He's like the king of this castle. His son Conrad is getting married to the princess Isabella. Literally, like right away, this giant helmet from nowhere falls, crushes him, and kills him. Conrad, the son who's getting married. No subtlety, just chaos from like literally page 1. Now, apparently, this giant helmet, and they're very clear in that. They like really emphasize that it is a giant helmet. I'm imagining like an actual giant, right? Like if you were seeing a giant, the helmet they would wear, because they're very descriptive and very like clear, is a very large helmet. This apparently fulfills a prophecy. So the prophecy is that the line will end, it will pass for Manfred whenever the real owner should be grown too large to inhabit it. That to me, didn't make a ton of sense. Nonetheless, it drives Manfred insane. So this is his grand idea. Such a man. He goes, you know what? My son is dead. I'm going to marry his fiance. Mind you, he is married. And I'm going to set aside my wife. And the wife's name, I'm going to butcher this. It was Hippolyta? Hippolita. Weird names, but it's fine. So I'm going to set aside my wife. I'm going to marry my dead son's fiance. And Isabella is not thrilled by this. She's like, that's not what I agreed to. I was supposed to marry your son. She's a princess in her own right. Manfred, this is how I'm going to avoid the prophecy fulfilling itself. As we continue on, again, no subtlety and the chaos. There's ghost apparitions. The supernatural elements are just like super in your face. Walking statues, talking portraits. I don't know why, but the walking statues reminded me of like in Harry Potter when Ron is on like the little chess piece and the like statues. That was totally what I was envisioning the entire time. I don't know how accurate that is, but that was the vision I conjured. But it's such a contrast to the Mysteries of Udolpho because the horror is more in your face. Whereas, like, in Mysteries of Udolpho, the horrors are of the mind, which I honestly is arguably worse. Like, because if you're not even safe in your own mind, I feel like that is such a harder thing to endure than, like, physical horror that you're seeing or enduring. Regardless. Isabella's father comes, he challenges Manfred's right to have Otranto, he loses, Isabella is able to be free of him, marries a man named Theodore, and Theodore becomes our new king of Otranto. But along the way, Manfred accidentally kills his daughter Matilda, thinking he's killing Isabella. Manfred just had so many avoidable things happen. Like, the entire time I was reading this, I was like, you are doing it to yourself. Kind of reminded me of Valancourt. I was like, you are doing this to yourself. Like, you're making it so much more complicated and challenging than it actually needs to be. But we end the novel there. Theodore becomes the rightful, ruler of Otranto, and Isabella is free of him. The juxtaposition between the two, like I said, really, for me, what I picked up on was what I said earlier. It's really stemmed in how they handled the fear or the horror element of a Gothic novel. I think the major difference is, right, obvious, the lack of subtlety in Castle of Otranto versus how subtle what was happening in the Mysteries of Udolpho. Like, it is truly Emily being psychologically tortured. This girl was being gaslit the entire time. I also think, like I mentioned, we have to look at that gender role, right? The male author and what he noticed, it's more dominant, it's more aggressive, it's battling things for inheritance and the right to rule. Whereas for Emily and for Anne Radcliffe, when she wrote The Mysteries of Udolpho, it's the subtle tortures that women go through. Arranged marriages, having no say in what happens to you. You have this guardianship. You're forced to go with this man, and he's now in charge of your life. It's about resilience and about really being able to survive through and being able to come out on the other side. It's loss of self and identity, and it's just so apparent between them. And I think this is going to really give such a beautiful foundation as we move into women's works, and also as we compare some of the original Gothic classics in modern media, but also just a lot of those that are written by males, and the voice comparison that you're going to see between the two. I'm very excited to now dive into that, because I think both of these novels just gave such a solid foundation. I had 2 discussion prompts that I gave myself because it was the week of Christmas. We said do Friday versus, trying to do it on actual Christmas. I think the next couple weeks will get a little bit better because we're not going to have like the holidays, but I digress. The first prompt was, what makes a text Gothic? Why did the Gothic appeal to women writers of the era? So I said Gothic text is described by its atmosphere and setting. Think eerie landscape, haunted castles, and an underlying theme of supernatural elements. It appealed to women writers because it allowed for them to safely explore themes they were unable to openly discuss, such as arranged marriages, fear of imprisonment, loss of self and identity. By writing stories with a supernatural element, that work was considered fiction or untrue, and they could safely explore those topics without fear of punishment. So I think what we see here is Anne Radcliffe is really describing what women are going through at that time, but she adds this layer of supernatural, right? Then if any male was to read that, they're going to discount it. Similar to the Las Conteuses of the 17th century, kind of parallel there. They discounted fairy tales and they discount Gothic because anytime you add in a magical or supernatural element, they're like, oh, it's not real. So the feelings are invalidated, even though that is how women are able to express themselves. They're like able to talk about arranged marriages. A lot of women, there is still, it even happens today still, are forced into these marriages because it's a transaction. Whether it was your father making the transaction, a guardian making the transaction, there was always something in it for someone else. Very rarely are they love matches, which is what you see a lot in Bridgerton, right? Like she wanted all her children to have love matches, which was not common. I know that is more fiction, but I digress. You get what I'm saying. So I think it was such a way for women to be able to speak their truth in a very safe way that they didn't fear any sort of retaliation. Now, my second prompt was, which early Gothic elements seem most influential on the 19th century text? So what I noticed was most influential elements that we can see in 19th century work and that we will continue to explore is arranged marriages or marriages lacking love or desire, forced imprisonment, which we see in Jane Eyre, and psychological torture and terror. A lot of times the horror is not blood and guts, it's horror of the mind. Main characters forced to question reality and fantasy is what they see real or fake, which is arguably worse than what we today think of horror, as because an attack on the mind means you have no escape. So, like I kind of talked about that theme earlier, it's really just this constant attack on what are you seeing? Is it real or is it fake? If you've ever been in a relationship with a narcissist or someone who gaslights you or anyone who has like any sort of substance abuse, they really make you feel crazy, right? Like that is what they do. They make you feel like what you are seeing is not reality or it's not really there. And these elements are kind of what you see in Gothic literature. It's like, is what I'm seeing there? Is this noise I'm hearing real? Is this black veil I'm seeing really there? And it makes you question yourself and your sanity. And you're trying to like figure out who you are in this moment in time. So I just think it's such a beautiful theme that we still see today, and it's unfortunate that it is still so present today because I wish, like, as women, we did still have to go through that. But I think it makes sense why those themes and elements became so well known, and it's something that we see in the 19th century work like Jane Eyre. We're definitely going to see that when we reread that, Wuthering Heights, that's apparent. And even in like the 13 Tales, which I think it was written in, like I said, 2005, like early 2000s. I would love to know your thoughts and if you notice these things as well. If you answered the discussion prompts, were you in line with what I maybe was thinking? Did you have a totally different interpretation? Because I think that's the beautiful thing about literature is it's all about intention and perception, and it's our own personal stories. And like what we go through is what we're going to kind of pull from each story, and we're going to relate to our own experiences. So I'd love to know if you were on track or just in general what you kind of thought. All right, so this is a beautiful segue into our module 2, which was mythology. Now, magic in the Middle Ages, we have not started that course yet, so we're only working on the lost Conteuses of the 17th century. And the parallels I saw, I just mentioned that, between the lost Conteuses and these Gothic writers and just what they were going through is really interesting. And it just goes to show, like, as women through history, it doesn't seem to matter how long or how recent it was. We all really go through similar themes and struggles. And I think that's why these Gothic novels and these fairy tales have stood the test of time, because it's themes that we can still relate to today. Jumping right on in. Las Conteuses, we read The Women of the Fairy Tale Resistance. And it's broken up into multiple chapters and it focuses on one woman in particular. So the one we did this week is the mother of fairy tales, Madame d'Aulnay, right? Her full name is Marie Catherine d'Aulnay. Now, the Women of Fairy Tale Resistance, I treated as my textbook. Within this textbook, she gives an overview of what the Women of Fairy Tales stood for, and it was very interesting to me. So I did not know this. You may have known this or not, but Charles Perrault, so as I mentioned him before, he wrote Cinderella, Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Mother Goose. He actually would frequent these salons. So these salons that the women had where they would play these fairy tale games. They would discuss fairy tales, they would write their short stories, and they would like present them. Think like a poetry reading. They would read it out to the audience. Everyone would give their feedback or their takeaways. They would play these fairy tale games. So it's so interesting that Charles Perrault would go to these. So again, he wrote his work after these women published their work. But the Brother Grimms, they actually called these women, and I don't want to misquote what they said, so I will read it to you. But when the Brother Grimms came into popularity, they criticized these salons and called the women inferior imitations of Charles Perrault, which is so interesting because Charles Perrault was going to their salon. It wasn't his, it was theirs. And he was hearing their stories, but he was calling them imitators? The audacity. The audacity. The Brother Grimms somehow, some way, along the, historical road, have become the fathers of fairy tales. And that is so not true. And I've read so much more on this. They were the keeper of tales. So they would, and they themselves said this. So I don't know at what point in time I don't know if it's because they cataloged everything, people just assumed they wrote it. And it's like that Mandela effect, right? If everyone believes the same thing, it becomes true, whether it was true or not. The Brother Grimms, they were just the keeper of tales. They would go places, hear someone's story, and then share it with the world. They weren't creating the stories really themselves. Now, Charles Perrault, he did create his story, but, and a big but, he was going to these salons. And it is very natural, like any book you read, and if you are a writer yourself, You're going to pull inspiration. But inspiration and imitation are two very different things. And when you are inspired by something, or you just imitate it, that is the problem. And that is how he discredited, or the Brother Grimms discredited these women, because they said that they were imitating Charles Perrault. Therefore, meaning they did not come up with these original ideas themselves. And that is so false. They wrote it first. And whether Charles pulled exact elements or not, I will leave that for you to form your own opinion on. He was inspired by them. There is no way he is frequenting this place that was all women and pulling ideas, and you're saying he wasn't inspired even a little bit. Especially knowing Madame d'Aulnay, she also coined, not only did she coin contes de fées, fairy tales, right? She coined Prince Charming, Prince Charmant. She came up with that concept. And we know Prince Charming was in Sleeping Beauty. So again, he pulled inspiration from somewhere. That was not an original idea of his. I get very passionate about this because it's so unfortunate that these women came up with these beautiful concepts. Like I said before, fairy tales have stood the test of time. They're so integral in society, and we just don't think of them. But starting now, we are. So share this knowledge, tell other people, because it's truly just so fascinating. It just really is. Now, Marie Catherine d'Aulnay, our lovely Madame d'Aulnay, the mother of fairy tales, she has a chaotic life, a chaotic story. I'm going to do my best to paraphrase and give you as much information about it as I can, but I highly recommend you read it in The Women of Fairy Tales because it's a lot more detailed out. Let's just jump right on in. She was born in 1650 to Judith Angelique, and her mother Judith was an interesting character as well. And there seems to be no mention of a father, at least from what I've read. So whether there was a father there present or not, I have not read enough about that. Judith Angelique would go to these gatherings, and she became friends with this man, I'm going to butcher his name, Francis d'Aulnay, and I will include his middle name, and I'll put it up here because, again, my French is not good. I took French in college, but my pronunciation, my accent is horrible, so I don't want to butcher it. But Francis de la Muse Baron d'Aulnay, him. Anyways, he was an openly gay man. This later becomes Marie Catherine's husband. Openly gay man, 30 years her senior. Now, I'm going to leave, again, a lot of this that I say. Always question everything you hear. I say this all the time, like as a historian, we are taught everything you hear, research it, find multiple sources to support it. I've done my research. You should do yours too. Like, hear what I'm saying, what I've learned. But I really do hope, and my genuine hope, is that you go on and you research this yourself. This is why I provide my reading list and where I'm getting my information from. So you too can read it, what you take away if you want to further your studies on it. Because in history, it is the world's longest game of telephone, right? And the reason I'm mentioning this now is because there's a lot of historians who argue on who Judith was, who Marie was, and as I get into the story, it'll make a little bit more sense. So the first thing that historians argue, because Judith herself did not write this down, this is written nowhere for us to validate. But I will say it makes sense based off of the actions taken. So it is said that Judith married Marie to Francis because he was an openly gay man, 30 years her senior. She would not have to perform the traditional marital duties outside of bearing children. Her herself was very opposed to this. It kind of makes sense. Like, that would make sense. I can validate that because if he's an openly gay man and has dated and had lots of relationships and it's not a secret and he's a lot older than her and he's not overly wealthy, I don't know what other reason, right, you would marry her to him, especially because Judith and him were friends to begin with. They were not friends at the end of this. So as they are married, Francis is not great with his money. He starts to lose his fortune. He starts to blame the king of the time for his loss and that the taxes that he's imposing, the rules that are being put in place, are the reason he can't keep his fortune. So he's now starting to run through Marie's fortune, and they're about to become desolate or very poor. Marie and her mother decide he's too much of a liability. We got to get rid of him. It's so beautiful. I'm obsessed. They're like, we got to get rid of this guy. Now, they don't want to kill him outright because that is not how it works to get your fortune back. Killing a man is going to go to her eldest child if it is a boy. But if we can get him arrested, right, on treason, we may get our money back. Judith and Marie hire these two men to coerce Francis into saying disparaging things about the king. That is legal. If you are caught doing that, you will actually be put in the Bastille, which if you've heard the Bastille, it's a horrible jail. You do not want to go to this place. So these two men coerce him. they get him to make statements about the king in a negative light. They take that information and he is arrested. But then Francis is like, hold up, wait a minute. I was forced to say these things. I don't truly believe them. I was made to believe them. Those two men are then put in jail into the Bastille. And Francis is released. Now they go to these two men and they go, who made you say these things? Why did you try and coerce him into these statements? And they sing like canaries. They're like, his wife and mother-in-law are the reason we did. So they go. They arrest Judith, which is the mother. They go to arrest Marie. Now here is where I know a baddie when I see one. Marie is like, I have some feminine hygiene issues I need to take care of. It's that time of month. Could you give me a minute and then I will go with you to jail? She locks herself in her room to take care of these problems. Now, these guards are like, she's a woman. She's not going to escape. They are not concerned in the slightest. But as time is going on, they're like, she should probably be done by now. Where is she? She's gone down some back hidden stairs, out the gate, took her kid, ran to family, and evaded capture. So now the guards are like, wow. We lost a woman. We were evaded by a woman. So they searched for her and she had some family that turned her in. That is how she was captured. Now this is again where historians can differ on, what happened. Both women were banished, Marie and her mother Judith. Now, Marie was banished for 13 years. Her mother was banished, I'm pretty sure, for the entirety of the rest of her life. And they are considered to be spies because when Marie came back after 13 years, she had rendered services to the crown. That's the official statement, right? Rendered services to the crown. Which, at this time, as a woman, there's really not much she could have done to render services. So a lot of historians believe and agree that both of them were acting as spies. They were in Holland, they were in Amsterdam, they went into Spain, so that they were gathering information and sending it back to the king. Again, form your own opinion, whatever is true. It's not officially documented what these services to the crown were. We really can't tell what it was. There is no primary source at the time that indicates overtly what it was, at least from what I've read. If you've read different and have a source, drop it in the comments. Let us know. I'd love to look into that more. Or Marie came back, and that is when she opened her salons, and that is when she started to publish her multiple fairy tales. Now, her two that were in this book that I read, because I have not read all of her fairy tales just yet, but I have read these two, were Bella and Feline. These were fantastic fairy tales, can I say? And there are some really, let me show you. There is some really great imagery that she had in here that I just want to show. I absolutely loved it. This was a beautiful image for Feline. I really love this book for the artwork. I believe there was one for Bella as well. Let's see. Yes, here it is. This was ours for Bella. Stunning. Quick synopsis on Feline and Bella. I highly recommend you read them. They are great. I was entertained the entire time I read these. Now, Feline, it's 3 sons. One inherit their father's crown. The father does not want to give up his crown. So he sends his son over the course of multiple years on what would be considered impossible task. Find the best dog. Find the thinnest thread that can go through this impossible needle. Things like that. The youngest son comes across his castle that is run by cats. Cats that can speak and talk full on. It's very Beauty and the Beast-esque. I feel like this is where Beauty and the Beast kind of comes from. As the story goes along, this princess cat who's in charge of this kingdom, he starts to fall in love with her because she is brilliant. They have great conversation. He spends each year there with her and then goes back to his father to present whatever prize, and she helps magically give him this prize. When he gets there with his prize, the king always comes up with a reason why he can't give up his kingdom. Now, the last time that the youngest son is here with our feline, our queen cat, he tells her, I have to find a bride, but I don't want to. I want to stay here. And she goes, if you care about me, I need you to cut my head off, cut my tail off, and burn it. I was like, Aka, what? What is this? What? And he is like, absolutely not. You're insane. I'm not doing that. And she goes, if you care about me, you will. So he does it. He chops off her head, cuts off her tail, and burns it. And then he's obviously distraught because he's mutilated this cat that he's come to a deep affection for. But then she comes back as a beautiful princess, and you find out she was cursed, and I won't get into why, but it's a beautiful story on why. And he takes her to his father, and his brothers have brought beautiful women as well, and they've all only looked at beauty. Now, she's a beautiful woman, but the king goes, this is how I'm going to win. They need to answer these questions from old texts. Mind you, she's a few hundred years old. Like, she's an immortal at this point. I don't believe when she became human she stays that way. But she's lived a long time, so she's actually read all of these old texts that he's asking questions on. And she answers everyone correctly. At this point, the kingdom should go to the youngest son. And the dad is still like, no, like he's trying to come up with excuses. And again, I know Marie Catherine was a baddie because she writes the baddie. This feeling goes, don't worry, I don't need your kingdom. I have 3, and I will give 2 to your other sons, and then your son will get the kingdom with me. She's like, you can keep your kingdom. And he begrudgingly, like, it takes a minute for him to even utter the words, thank you. Great fairy tale. 10 out of 10. Really recommend you read it because there's so many elements that we see in later fairy tale retellings. Now, Bella is very Mulan-esque, because the king needs sons or fathers to come fight his war. This guy only has 3 daughters. Each one tries to become a man, but they all get sent back because they're in this little glen and they run across this woman and she's stuck with her sheep and they refuse to help her and she calls them a woman. And they're like, oh, my disguise doesn't work. Well, the youngest daughter, she goes and she helps, and this, becomes a fairy godmother. So then you've got like a Cinderella element, and she gives her this magical chest and she's like, any clothing that you put on will turn you into a man. So she becomes a man. Falls in love with the king falls in love with her, then she becomes a woman again. There's a lot that I'm like glossing over, but it is a fantastic fairy tale. Again, you've got Mulan retellings, which Mulan obviously was written first, that's based on history. But then you also have like the Cinderella moment of this fairy godmother situation and her kind of like ball gown turning her into a man. It's really good. I know I'm not giving you all the details because it's kind of hard to, because it's not lengthy, but a lot happens in a short amount of time, and I don't want to spend too much time on it. But 10 out of 10, both of these fairy tales, I was thoroughly entertained the entire time I was reading them. And to know how old they are, again, the elements still ring true today. There was this like overarching theme between our Gothic literature and our women of fairy tales. The resilience, the persistence, the rationale mindset. Like, that is how Bella is able to win over the king, and she goes to this other kingdom for him. And there's a way that she is able to solve all of the problems of this kingdom by literally just being a woman and thinking like a woman, and it is so beautiful to see. But again, very similar to Gothic literature. The way these women were able to tell their stories, to have a safe space, they had to add magic and this supernatural element where men would disregard. These salons were considered like, it's where the women gather. It was of no substance. That's why Charles Perrault being there was so important, because he was validating the work that they were doing, because he took inspiration from it. Copy inspiration, you make that judgment call. But it is just such a reminder that it is so important to always question what you hear. I think that's what literature will teach you, no matter what literature you read. You have to form your own thoughts. Don't believe what I say. Don't believe what you're find your own opinions. Form your own theories. Now, we can have agreeances. You can be like, I agree with what you're saying. I've researched it. That is fair. But never take what someone says at face value and just be like, yes, this is like the Bible. There has to be a sense of curiosity in everything that you do. Because when we allow other people's perceptions, the hive mentality, to take over, we're doing a disservice to ourselves, because we're no longer allowing ourselves to be individual thinkers. And that's what makes us beautiful and unique. Everyone has their own story, their own perception, their own interpretation. But history is also written through the lens of the winner. And it's honestly and typically written through the lens of a male writer. So when you can find these women texts, you may think you know everything about a specific time period. You may not, and it's okay. And it's in history, right? If we didn't have these texts, we would have no idea, because the people who were alive back then, their descendants and their descendants and their descendants, again, oral storytelling is another game of telephone, and things get lost in how we change our verbiage and our understanding, our terminology. Always question what you hear. I think anything in personal curriculum, if you're doing it to this extent, it is so important to expand your mind and to really get into the theming and the deep work of these novels, or even of these fairy tales. It was such a treat this week to really sit and understand at this level. So I will leave you with that. on the mythology point of view before we dive into our third module, which was creative writing and taking these Brandon Sanderson's course, which is so funny because I feel like all of these tie together so well because Brandon Sanderson's a science fiction writer. Where does this come from? It comes from all of these women writers, right? It comes from a fairy tale, then it turns into a Gothic literature, then it turned into science fiction with Mary Shelley, and then we have our modern retelling. So it's such a beautiful, flow. I love it. I don't think I've actually shown these. So these are my beautiful little journals that I created and did. They're like Louise Carmen dupes. I actually need to post a video on how I made them, but this is my creative writing one, so we're going to actually pull it out because it was so fun. I highly recommend Brandon Sanderson's course. If you're going to spend time or you want to write something, that course is so worth it. I'm going to pull out my little notebook here because this was my first time really diving into this. And so the way it works is he's a professor at Brigham University, BYU. And this is a course that he is hosting in person. So there's actual discussion going on, which is really cool because it makes you feel like you're in a lecture hall. And that is probably what I miss the most about college, was sitting in a large group of people and kind of ping-ponging different ideas. And again, the questions that kind of come from that and where the class will go. Brandon Sanderson's so funny. He's really comical on how he teaches. And he talks about tangents and I'm I relate so much to that because I can go on tangents. So I have to also have an outline about what I'm going to discuss or else we'll be way off topic. So week 1, the video was titled The Philosophy of Professional Writing. I'm going to read some of my notes from it because it was really engaging and it was helpful in where I'm at in my writing process because he talks a lot about the different types of writers. And then we'll get into the discussion prompt that I had for this one. Now, I know I've kind of already gone past Las Conteuses and Mythology. There was no discussion prompt for that one this week. It was literally just readings and it was more about my learning objective. So we did not miss anything. You did not miss a prompt for that. I only had them for Gothic Literature this week and then for creative writing. So one of the things that he says is his philosophy. He goes over the philosophy of the class. And he says, nothing can teach you more about writing than just writing. I felt so called out in a way because it is so true for me as a writer. I can very much get caught in the weeds of things and I can get caught in the perfectionism of things. And he's you just have to write. And his big thing that he says is, it takes about 5 novels for you to write for your 6th one to actually be something you can sell. And he talks a lot about what kind of writer are you? Are you a hobbyist writer? Are you maybe someone who writes a novel every 5 years? Once every 20 years? Or are you a professional writer? He is one of the most famous writers of our time. He makes a full, very good living from this. So when he is speaking on this, it comes from personal experience. And he was talking about his writing class that he took in 1998 at Brigham and how out of that class, only 4 of the 20 went on to be professional writers. And I think what was so helpful, he said, a lot of people will say being a professional writer or being able to make a living as a professional writer, it's 1 in a million. He's that's actually not true. It's probably every 4 in 20, but he's 4 in 20 of very talented writers. And I think he also said it's probably smaller than that, maybe 4 in 15, because a lot of people will give up, right? And a lot of people get lost in revisions. Someone had a great question. They asked, what if I've created this world that I absolutely love, care about, and do not want to give up, but how do I write 5 novels within that and be okay with maybe the 6th one being the one that takes off? And so he said there's a couple of different approaches. Some writers, what he did, is the Cosmere universe, which I am going to be reading, and that's on my 2026 goal. I've done Mistborn, but I really haven't done the whole thing, and so I'm going to actually read the whole thing, and I will definitely share that here. But getting off topic, tangent, he said for his Cosmere universe, he wrote about 5 novels within that universe, just different stories, before he got Elantris, which was his first one that was published. And I was that is such a great way. He was you don't have to give up this world you've created, but maybe write different stories within that world, flesh them out, and then, maybe the 5th or 6th one will be the one that actually takes off, and you go from there. He also said, I cannot remember the author's name, but there was an author who did something similar, but she actually wrote 4 novels that were all of one story. So you have a main character, this would be part 2, part 3, part 4, versus here's 4 different main characters all in the same world. So he's you can approach it in any way you'd like, and maybe instead of writing a new novel each time, a new story, you're reworking that same novel. Now he says that can be done through revisions, or that can be done by you wrote book 1, and then you're let me rewrite book 1. And he says, you will be a better writer for it. And I think that was so intimidating to hear, because it's like, to spend time writing is hard. To come up with a novel is hard. To do that multiple times, it takes resilience. And I think that was what I needed to hear, that it's like that persistence and to not get caught in the weeds. Like he said, do not rewrite your first chapter 20 times. You'll never write a novel. He's like, write the whole book, revise it, or rewrite it again. And he said, because anyone can write off of an idea. An idea is a dime a dozen. I was like, oh, fair. And he was talking about, let me see. So he had said, ideas are cheap, but the ability to make them great is what publicists are looking for. So he's like, any idea, you can come up with an idea, but to be able to actually turn that into a novel, that's key. And to be able to write that novel, revise that novel, and keep going, that is what's going to separate, right, the wheat from the chaff, or that like farmer terminology. And I was like, it was so important, I think, to hear. And he says, set daily writing goals. So what he would do is he said, I'm going to write 1,000 words. And then after I've written my 1,000 words, I can do whatever I want with my day. I can play Halo. I can read whatever other books I want to do. And so I think that's something I'm going to take into my writing, is I'm going to give myself a number count. Like, I need to write X amount of words every day. And that is how I'm going to be able to finish. And I'm not going to get stuck. Not going to get stuck in the weeds. I'm putting it out here. I'm being accountable. I'm not going to do that. I also love that he said there are 2 different types of writers. So you've got your discovery writer and an outlier. So the discovery writer is someone who is like a Stephen King, who they write their novel and the ideas come to them. Then an outlier is a person who writes out everything that's going to happen. This is how it's going to start. This is like my meat and potatoes. This is going to be the turning point of the novel. This is going to be the end. And they structure it that way. I guess Stephen King said the death of a writer is an outline or something, meaning to write an outline is the death of a novel, because for him to know what's going to happen, it doesn't work that way for him. He needs to allow the story to tell him where it's going. And so that was such an interesting take to see that there's such different types of writers. I actually use this program called Scrivener, and recommend if you're a writer to use that program. And it actually is formatted, I did not realize it at the time, but it's formatted for both outliers and discovery writers, because you can actually write any part of the book and then kind of move the pieces around. Like, think of it like on flashcards and you're like moving A, B, and C. Or you can completely outline and then fill in the gaps. And now that I've listened to that explanation, I'm like, oh, like, it was created for one or the other, or for both. And he said some people fall like in the middle, like some kind of have a rough outline. It's not like this super detailed outline. I know this is how I want them to start and where I want them to end. And I'm going to discover as I'm writing how they're going to get from A to B. I feel like I fall probably more in that, but we'll talk about later because that's part of my discussion prompt. But it was really great. He also said to bundle your habits, which I think habit stacking is something you hear everyone talk about. If you're a writer and you're like, I need to get my 1,000 words, like what else can you pair it with that you already do to make it achievable? I think that was great advice. And then he said to encourage an aggressive writing schedule if you have not written 3 to 5 novels. So if you've not written 3 to 5 novels, you better have an intense writing schedule, because you need to catch up. And I was like, noted, Brandon Sanderson. I wrote that down. And it's also going to help you find your style, because you may think you write one way and then you write another. And what I'm actually doing unintentionally is I have a writing group. So if you follow me on TikTok, you know Ariel. She's on a lot of my videos, and she's going to be doing this with me. And we are going to be meeting once a week in person to discuss what we watched and read. The discussion prompt, we're going to have a verbal discussion. And then we're going to be helping each other with a novel. But I'm so glad that this is what he talked about in week 1, because it's actually so important for us to know this. He said writing groups can either make or break a novelist. And I was like, oh, what do you mean? And so what he said is writing groups is a great way to get feedback, but you have to be careful about when and how you're getting that feedback. He said if you are a discovery writer, do not give writing feedback until your novel is done. Because he said he had this girl in his class, and she would write a chapter, talk about it in the group. The next chapter, completely different. Would get feedback. The next chapter, it was like 3 different books of chapters, because the example he used, and I'm paraphrasing here, was someone said, oh, you should write about vampires, that's important. So there was no mention of vampires in chapter 1, but the next chapter, all of a sudden vampires. And then let's say, and again, I'm paraphrasing here, you should set it in medieval time. Then all of a sudden the book moves to medieval time. And because she was a discovery writer, she was allowing them to influence her writing. And I was like, that is so important to know, because if that is how you write, you don't want to be influenced prematurely, right? You want to get what you're thinking out, then allow someone to give feedback. Now, he also said that when getting feedback, try not to say anything, because when you're getting feedback, you don't want to give away or like give them any notion of what's coming next. You just want to be like, okay, that's great feedback. and apply what you can. I think he said maybe 1/3 of feedback for himself is what he'll actually put into his books, because he doesn't want to give too much away to this writing group. He wants them to give feedback, and he's going to take away what he needs to. What a great way to set some boundaries, but to also still be collaborative. I love that. And he said when he formed his writing group, he was so intentional about the people he put in his group. So I think that's really great. If you decide to follow along in this course and you maybe decide you want to meet with some of your friends in real life, I think that's something you should really take away, because I will definitely be taking that away. Get the feedback and just absorb it, right? Take it in. They talk about that in therapy. Like, sometimes you have to hear someone's opinion and you don't always have to have a rebuttal. Take it in, listen, and then provide feedback. I think that's great. He also said if you give feedback, so in turn, if you are also in this writing group and you are now the one to provide someone that feedback, if you give feedback, be descriptive, not prescriptive. I was like, pop off. I'm going to be using that moving forward. And what he means by that is you want to be descriptive in the feedback. You want to be helpful, but you don't want to tell them what to write. So that could look like you could say, hey, when I read about the king hearing this prophecy, I was really confused on what the prophecy is. Like, that didn't make sense to me. Instead of saying, I think your prophecy should say, it's your interpretation. I did not understand. Now it's up to you to help me understand, versus because I didn't understand, here's what I think you should say. And I think that's so important and crucial. The hour flew by as I was watching. I actually watched it twice just to make sure I didn't miss anything. And I love that it is a live lecture. It's not just him talking to the camera, because you're getting people asking questions in real time. And then he's able to offer advice on those questions that we may not have gotten if someone didn't ask. So I think it's great. Just 10 out of 10. Now, my discussion prompt was, what does writing as a craft mean for how you approach your work? Are you closer to a discovery writer, an outliner, or somewhere between? Which pieces of writing advice has never worked for you and why? And what are your long-term writing goals and how does this course support them? For me, I feel like I am a mixture of a discovery writer and an outlier. I definitely sometimes will be driving and I have a playlist for my book, and I'll hear a song or something that I think would relate, and I can see a scene in my mind like that, and then I can go and write it. So I feel like that's more of a discovery because I'm being influenced, right? And I do feel as I write, I really hear the character's voice in my head and they tell me where they want to go. I do have somewhat of an outline because I am a type A person, but I will say when I'm writing, I'm probably my least type A in terms of my craft or like my artistry. Now, when I am trying to perfect it and I want someone to read it, that is where my type A comes out, because I'm like, ooh, I want it to be perfect. That's something I took away from his material, was I need to be less perfect and I need to not sit, right, rewriting the same thing over and over. I just need to write it. And if it's horrible, I write it again. And I was like, okay, I can do that. Because he did say there's very few who will write one novel and it's an instant success. Like J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter, Twilight with Stephanie Meyer. I gave another example. I think Hunger Games also was one of her first novels, Suzanne Collins. Over here I've got Fourth Wing, and Rebecca Yarros is actually a great example of someone who wrote a ton of novels. She wrote a bunch of romance novels before Fourth Wing became what it was. So that's like good to know. Now the second part was, what does writing as a craft mean for you? He was talking a lot about, are you professionalist or hobbyist? I feel like right now I'm more of a hobbyist because I do have a traditional 9-to-5. I do have a career. And he was saying when he was a writer, that was the goal. Victoria Aveyard also talks about that. I think she's also one who her first novel became like the Red Queen, what it was. Her family allowed her to live at home and they gave her a year. They said, you've got a year, write what you can and see if you can become a professional, or you got to go get like a traditional job. Brandon Sanderson was very similar. His job was to be a writer. Like, he did not want to spend too much time in a traditional job. Whereas like for me, I have a career and I'm very happy in it. Doesn't mean I don't want to be a writer, but it's not like I'm going to quit my job to be a writer before I publish something. So I feel like that would label me more as a hobbyist, which I'm totally fine with. It would be great one day to be like a professional writer, but I do know how challenging it can be, like he said, 420. So I think it's definitely a goal, but not the end goal, if that makes sense. And then the last one was, what are your long-term writing goals and how does this course support them? I think for me, this course is helping pull me out of my mind, because like it being filmed like a true lecture is so helpful for me personally. And I think it was also like giving permission to be like, write it 10 times if you have to. And it may take 20 times for that one book to be worth it and for someone to actually want to publish it. So I think that's just, I'm just going to write. Those are my goals, is I'm going to give myself a writing count. Like I said, I'm still going to go through every week of his course. And at the end of it, I know in my spring curriculum for my creative writing piece, it's just going to be writing. I want to finish the first book. Even if it's awful, even if I get through like 500 pages and I'm like, okay, I wrote it, I did it, it was crap, let's do it again. Because I think that is what I need to do, is just write it. If it's awful, that's okay. You have permission. It takes 5 to 6 books sometimes. For me, I think I want to publish the first book that I have the idea on. But if I have to write it 5 times, so be it. Because he also said it's possible. You may have to write it like 5 or 6 times for it to be good. I'm okay with that versus writing 5 or 6 novels in the universe. So that is what I took away from that. I would love to know what you took away, what kind of writer you feel like you are. Are you going to do a writing group yourself? Or are you maybe going to just do it solo, which he also said is a valid way to do it? Or are you maybe going to wait until you feel like you have a solid novel before you would involve other people? I'd love to know. My highlights of the week were definitely the crossover of all 3 modules with the focus on women. Just to see, like how I said earlier, fairy tales parlayed into Gothic literature. Gothic literature has parlayed into the modern media and the modern writings that we see. I think that's just so beautiful. I just really loved that like full circle moment. I also realized, so this would be like a takeaway, but maybe a negative one, how much reading I gave myself was a lot. It wasn't that I wasn't able to do it, but it really didn't leave me time for much else. And I don't know if it's because it was the holiday week. I felt like it was hard to balance seeing family and then also reading. I'm going to see how that goes over the next 30 days before I make a decision if I want to scale back on how much I was reading. Because when I'm not like hanging out with family all the time in terms of like at a holiday and like midweek, like the weekends would be fine if I can get everything done during the week like I used to do in college. But because like you had stuff happening on like Wednesday and Thursday, it made it a little bit more challenging and I felt like a little bit more rushed. But I'm going to give it a couple of weeks. Probably 30 days, like I said, not a couple weeks, because next week is also New Year's Eve, before I make that final decision if I feel like it was too much. And honestly, it'll be like how I feel over time. Like the first week's always easy because you're like so excited. But as you continue to go on in your studies, will I be able to keep that same momentum going? I will also say reading classics took longer than I'm used to. I can usually get through a book very, very quickly. But reading a classic novel, there's a different way to read it. And it takes you a little bit longer because it's not written how you're used to reading, right? So I feel like I need to give myself a little bit more grace with that because I was like, oh my God, why is this taking me so long to get through? And then I was like, okay, this is just not a normal reading style for myself. And that's why it took so much. But I will say another key highlight for me was definitely Brandon Sanderson. I thoroughly enjoyed that entire video. Let's talk about what's upcoming. Week 2, we'll be watching the next in Brandon Sanderson's writing course, which that is going to be the story structures, plot, and theory. That's what it will be for creative writing. Now for mythology, we are going to be continuing to read The Woman of Fairy Tale Resistance. We're going to be moving on to our next Las Conteuses, which is Henriette-Julie Murat. We will be reading her next, some of her work, and seeing the differences between her and Madame d'Aulnay. We will also be reading some of the fairy tales from Madame d'Aulnay. I finally got that book, or got it on my Kindle, so we'll be reading a couple more of her specific fairy tales and parlaying it up against Henrietta's and seeing the differences between the two. On Gothic literature and modern media, so that module, we are going to be reading London Labor and London Poor, and comparing that to what we've already read before we start diving into our meat and potatoes, like getting into Dracula and all of those novels. Now, for the women authors of the 19th century, we will be reading Frankenstein. I'm very excited. I'm so excited to dive into Frankenstein. I wanted to mainly focus on the introduction in the book and her letters. So Mary Shelley had some letters, as well as there's a really big intro into the book. So I'm going to be reading those first before I actually dive into the novel itself. And then we will have a mixture of discussion prompts. I did give myself one short essay. I'm talking like a page. And then another in-person discussion for Brandon Sanderson's course. So that's going to be like it for week 2. It's another holiday week, so I didn't want to be too heavy. I will start picking up as we move into January. Mainly because then I have my whole January TBR. I have a book for my book club I need to read. So I'm definitely going to be reading a little bit more heavy, but I'm glad next week isn't too robust just because, again, it's a holiday. It's going to be like one of those weird weeks. And I swear the week between Christmas and New Year's is always kind of like a fever dream, you know? There's really no days anymore. It's just kind of like you're existing. But I am so excited you are here following along. Please leave comments. Let me know what you think so far, what you've decided to read. If you're following my personal curriculum, if you've created your own, I would love to know. And I will see you back here for week 2.